So obviously we take slightly different views, and one of the things that colours my views, having been there at the time...
I can forgive the initial fear. I can't forgive the continuation of it for so long. I think Boris was an absolute disaster as a Prime Minister. I almost think they didn't deliberately do the migration, but they were so relaxed about it because Boris is more of a Liberal than a Conservative. That was a problem.
There was definitely
People
a
in
division between George Osborne and David Cameron. There's a long and lengthy question, and I want to respond or hear the Minister respond. What? That's idiotic. Have you finished? Hello, welcome to Quite Right's Question and Answers. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator.
This week on Quite Right Questions and Answers, lockdown. Did we go too far? We'll also be looking at the Conservatives' broader record in government. Why was it that we found Conservatives who were talking right, but governing left? And we'll also be considering what are the most irritating questions that politicians get asked, and also how irritated are politicians by the sketches that skewer their vanity.
This question is from Robert Brown. After the COVID inquiry found that lockdown has left lasting scars on society, was lockdown the right decision? Should the UK have followed Sweden's example instead?
I think lockdown was the right decision overall, but in a way, lockdown covers a multitude of sins, and I do mean sins. So taking the decision to restrict social mixing was, I felt, necessary in order to reduce the spread of the virus. It spread through social contact. If the virus had spread unchecked, then the number of people who would have been infected would have been greater than the capacity of our health service to handle. And that would have led to knock-on effects on health and on the economy even worse than those that we saw. But I think there's a legitimate question to ask about, A, should we have enforced the lockdown with the full weight of criminal law? And B, were some of the decisions that were made, particularly but not exclusively, about children at school, the right decisions? And people look to Sweden as a parallel, as a check on what we did. Again, I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of what they did in Sweden. They did very clearly say that social mixing had to be restricted. Some schools were closed. There were restrictions, voluntary but clear, on meeting in public. But I think for many people, the fact that Sweden was able to restrict the spread of the virus without using the full force of the criminal law shows that we might have been better going down a different path.
This has all really come to the fore because we've had our own COVID inquiry produce another report. Although I was actually, when I looked into it, I was amazed by how much longer there is to go. I think they've only reported now on 2 modules. And the out of 10, yeah, exactly. So the whole thing will trundle on at least until next year and possibly longer, I expect. But they ended up coming out and saying that, basically rehashing, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but rehashing the old Professor Neil Ferguson data about if we had locked down earlier, 23,000 lives would have been saved. But my understanding was that model predicted that if Sweden needed to lock down sooner, or it also predicted like a shocking number of lives lost. And that never happened.
No.
So I'm just amazed that we're still using these rubbish in, rubbish out models and drawing serious insights from this. I'm also amazed that we've had to pay for the privilege £200 million.
Yes. The disappointing thing about the COVID inquiry is that it doesn't seem to have, not only does it not seem to have unearthed anything particularly new, it's really a recitation of the arguments that we had at the time, even though there is much more that we know now. So the argument about whether or not we should have locked down a week earlier was an argument that was raging at that time and in the immediate aftermath. You're right, the 23,000 figure comes from a model from Professor Neil Ferguson, which has been, I don't think discredited is the word, but certainly it's been very, very robustly dismantled as a, not tendentious, but certainly, what's the word? Uncertain projection. So treating it as though it were a mathematical certainty is a big mistake. And then a lot of the stuff around the inquiry is just based on the most lurid WhatsApps and the loudest voices that were critical of the government at that time. What it doesn't take account of is the evidence that we now have about the validity of different approaches and the costs, which, while appreciated, weren't fully factored in.
But isn't it crazy also that one of the things that the inquiry doesn't appear to be looking at, which I think is highly relevant and actually an example of where Sweden suggests that we should have followed their lead, is the data on all-cause excess mortality. Because the argument was that we will save these lives in the short term, but in the long run, there will be much greater collateral damage.
Yes. There
will be cancers that go untreated, the NHS, basic procedures suspended, screenings, etc. And I think that has very much come to bear. If you start looking at all-cause excess mortality, Sweden really does start to look very good in terms of the graphs and data. Isn't it astonishing that is not really being discussed by the COVID inquiry? I mean, perhaps it will in time, but the initial reporting does not give me much hope of that.
So obviously we take slightly different views, and one of the things that colours my view is having been there at the time, and it's very difficult, of course, to abstract yourself now and to judge your own performance at the time entirely objectively. But all that having been said, you can't have an inquiry of this kind, particularly not taking this length of time, particularly not when other countries have had their own inquiries, without looking at what happened in other jurisdictions and judging, did we get it right in comparison with those? Because I might say, well, if we'd followed a different path, if we hadn't locked down, then the NHS might have been overwhelmed. And I say that not out of affection for the NHS necessarily, but simply because that would have meant that you would not have had even emergency treatment available because hospitals would have been full. You can legitimately say, well, you can't prove that, Michael.
Yeah.
But what you
and
can do...
there were lots of empty Nightingale hospitals.
Yeah. What you can do is look at other countries and how they managed it, and you can look at the evidence that we now have about the spread and form a proper judgment. That doesn't mean that Boris or me or Matt Hancock were necessarily sinful, but we were mistaken. And I'd actually prefer to have that rigorous analysis because I think that it would deal with, I think, some of the misconceptions that have arisen about the choices that were available. And even if it ended up saying that the government overreacted, I would rather that we had that out than having, which is what I fear we have, a thin and inadequate account of what happened.
There's just, though, the view that if the government doesn't tell people and force them legally to do things, that it will not happen.
Yeah.
But actually, the data now suggests that, I mean, we've known this for many years. I don't know why I said the data now. Like, the data shows that COVID was falling before the peak because many people had altered their behaviour. Well, they weren't going to things. I think even more so than in Sweden, the mobile phone data, you can track how people kind of roaming. We cut our mobility by sort of 60% before lockdowns.
Yes, and this is I think at the heart of the distinction. If people say we should never have locked down, and they also argue that life should have gone on exactly as before, I think that is a more difficult road to hoe because the evidence is that everywhere, even in those countries that had the lightest restrictions, people restricted social contact. And unless and until someone can show scientifically that you, A, don't need to worry about the effect of the virus, and B, that social contact has or unregulated social contact has a minimal impact on its spread, then some method of diminishing social contact has to be a way of managing the virus. The crux of it, as you say, though, is do we need to criminalise activity as distinct from relying on people's sense of what's in the common interest?
What I just cannot forgive, because, I was working as a journalist during that time and I was quite sceptical of lockdown. I don't think I wasn't opposed to the first lockdown because it was also terrifying and completely unknown. Although I will say that I think that even without the official government lockdown, so many people had changed their behaviour. You walked past a pub, there was no one in it, even if it was open. But what I really cannot forgive, I can forgive the initial fear. I can't forgive the continuation of it for so long, nor the fact that there seemed to be, I think unlocked in many people, both government MPs, but also ordinary people, a desire to control and to really punish their fellow man.
Yes,
there was such a lack of forgiveness or understanding. You know, there were people, I met people at a party recently who were telling me, I can't remember, someone mentioned lockdown. I think we partly don't want to talk about this because it was not a happy time for most of us. So we're quite happy to move on and forget. They were talking quite proudly about how they called the snitch hotline on their neighbours. And I just looked at them and thought, that's disgusting. You shouldn't be proud of that.
Right.
You know, if it'd be like going to Salem, Massachusetts in 1697 and people were like, oh, I killed Rebecca Nurse, look at me. I'm just a bit like, you shouldn't be proud for doing that. That was a really disgusting thing to do. You don't know what your neighbour was going through. Some people were really suffering in such a way that they never recovered. Older people never... my father deteriorated badly during lockdown, not having the kind of day-to-day contacts with people. It's amazing how much people's structures and routines keep them alive and keep them in a vaguely positive way. And into this steps these awful kind of like utterly unforgiving people who they just see a desire to control. And that even when the rules became manifestly insane, you know, we were having arguments about the proper diameter of a Scotch egg to count as a substantial meal so that you could go to the pub and have a drink or not. And they actually, I think someone actually had to calculate what the diameter of a Scotch egg was so that it could be constitute a substantial meal. Like even just taking a step back and, you know, we don't have to be Marcus Aurelius and go into first principles. This is clearly insane. It makes no consistent sense. And those of us who were saying, hold on a minute, that's crazy, we're being told that we were murderers, we didn't care what happened, we wanted to kill our grandmas and all the rest of it. I actually find it makes me angry even to think about it because of the number of times I was accused of wanting to kill people just for having a different opinion.
Yes, often from people who have no problem in extending the termination of unborn children's lives, or who are at the same time encouraging the elderly to avail themselves of assisted dying. Putting that point to one side, however, you, I think, make some very powerful points. I think that the snitch culture is terrible. I think that it is a malign consequence of what I think is a virtuous impulse, but a virtuous impulse that you have to treat with care. And that virtuous impulse is the desire for people to feel part of something bigger, that desire to believe that there is a common endeavour, almost like wartime, which demands a level of sacrifice. In Evil and War's Sword of Honour trilogy, Guy Crouchback, who's the hero at the end, often reflects on the extent to which some people actually welcomed the war because it was a way of making up for the hedonism and self-indulgence of what had passed beforehand. And I think that there was a case that there was a spirit from some that almost embraced the idea of sacrifice, applauding the NHS, that it was a war spirit revived. And this is not a criticism of the Queen. She's magnificent, was magnificent. The fact that she invoked Vera Lynn and We'll Meet Again meant that there was something of that spirit. That is a wholly noble spirit. But I think you would probably say, yes, it is, Michael, or it may be, but having it annexed to government enforcing the deprivation of liberty and encouraging neighbourhood Stasi activities when people happen to be going out for one more regulated walk than they should was terrible. Yeah.
I think I would say that we often don't talk about we talk a lot about the Blitz spirit, but during the Second World War, that wasn't the only thing that was going on here.
Yes.
There was a lot of spivery and people manipulating the rules to their own ends. You know, there'd be the Blitz, and then people might use the cover of the Blitz to go and steal things from people's houses. Like there was a fair bit of that murkier downside that we hear less about in the history books.
I think that's true, and I think that one must unnecessarily romanticise or demonise any particular period. And I think it's also the case that the sense that we were facing a particular challenge from this virus was capable of mobilising that sentiment. But governments have to be very, very careful at times like that, because if you're drawing on that sense of patriotic sacrifice, then it's not just the case that you or I might feel virtuous for restraining ourselves at that time. As you quite correctly point out, others are paying a bigger price. School children paid perhaps the biggest price now. And one of the things that I'm often reproached with is A, not just school closures, but B, the furlough scheme, which, while justified perhaps in its own terms, nevertheless created such an overhang of debt and public spending that if you're a young person now, your school days were blighted. If you were at university, you had a less than full university experience. Government spending has never been appropriately, despite the efforts of some, pared back since then to take account of that massive debt overload. And while it was noble to try to ensure that the NHS was there for everyone, the costs are ringing down the generations.
But the trouble is, like, the budget last week increases student loan debt repayments.
Yes.
And it massively increases through the freezing of thresholds. It directly clobbers young professionals who are just starting out in the world. There has never been any repayment of the sacrifice that young people made. You don't even sense a great deal of gratitude in some quarters. And of course, lockdown was something that it worked much better if you were living in a nice house somewhere with a garden. Yes. And the experience of a young person in a city, for example, away from their family, no garden, no balcony, nothing, is a very different one. And I saw very little recognition of that experience in the kind of official lockdown narrative. And of course, the debt that we took on is something that will be paid by multiple generations to come.
Yes. Our next question comes from someone who wishes to remain anonymous. Why exactly do the Conservatives end up talking right but governing left? Why would anyone vote Conservative again, given the same thing is likely to happen, irrespective of what the leader might say? Well, I suppose I should really try to answer this one initially. The person who first used the phrase talking right but governing left was actually Kemi Badenoch, when she was giving a reckoning on what the Conservatives had got wrong, as well as some of the things they got right, during the 14 years in power. My first, it might seem needlessly pat response, is the fact that it was the leader who said that and who identified, straight out of the gates what she felt was wrong over the course of the last 14 years, and the fact that she's demonstrated since then that she's determined not to make that same mistake, I think is probably the best argument for voting Conservative. The fact that she's capable of drawing a line between the past and the future. But I also think that, without wanting to sort of get into a fight with Kemi, because it's never a good idea, that talking right but governing left describes some of what happened, particularly on migration, but not everything.
I think that it's a long-standing problem. I didn't know that Kemi Badenoch was the first person to use that term, because I feel like it's been used a lot for some time, and it very adequately captures the problem. I think it's a problem that goes all the way back to the coalition government. I'd say the original sin of it was perhaps a belief, I think, in David Cameron Osborne quarters, that in order to win that election, they had to basically accept many tenets of the Blairite revolution. They had to essentially say, we will agree with basically everything that you've done. We just have some disagreement. We want the state to be slightly smaller. I think that was a misdiagnosis. The public are not massively progressive. It was a mistake to think that what they liked about Blairism was the social change. It was perhaps that they more tolerated it because of the illusion of prosperity that occurred during that decade. It's basically say, well, if you like having, Italian restaurants and soy sauce, then you have to go along with kind of net zero and race communism. I think that was the first mistake. And I know that this may be, perhaps I'm being uncharitable, but I think there was a vibes-based element to it that continued. And I think you can see it very clearly in Theresa May's initial decision to be fully for gender self-ID. That is the move of someone who wants the world to say, they're the nice party now, we're not the baddies. Of course, that's such an unconservative thing to do, because conservatism should be about prudence, thinking of the next generation, thinking of the future. And I think if you're with a truly conservative hat on, you would look at that and say, actually, perhaps society has recognised that there are differences, biological differences between men and women that have to be respected. This has not happened overnight. Perhaps our forefathers had a point about this. But no, instead they were like, oh yeah, you can go where you want, gender self-ID. That's a liberal thing to do, not a conservative. Yes. I don't think you would have had it without that feeling of we have to detoxify ourselves because we're the baddies, which bespeaks a loss of confidence in conservatism right from the get-go. And that was a big problem. I think Boris was an absolute disaster as a prime minister. Never been a big fan of his. I almost think they didn't deliberately do the migration, but they were so relaxed about it because Boris is more of a liberal than a conservative. And he liked the idea of being able to say, we voted Brexit so we could have kind of global Britain outward facing. You can't call me a little Englander. Again, a lot of people voted Brexit because they're worried about immigration. And it's a terrible mistake to ignore that view. This whole thing about being perceived as high status, actually, Conservatives need to learn to actually dance with the one that brung you and not disdain the people who put them in where they are.
Well, I'm emphatically low status and have always been. And I think that there is absolute truth in what you say about migration and painful truth in what you say about self-ID, and it's embraced by Theresa and by Maria Miller and, for a period, actually, by Liz Truss. And I'm also guilty, I think. We don't have enough time to run through all of the things that are crimes or sins that can be laid at my door. But not just for the Tory years, but also for the Blair years, I think it is important to try to draw distinctions. Now, this might seem as though I'm engaging in medieval scholasticism and discussing how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. But first on Blair, all sorts of terrible things happened during the Blair administration. But they were things that Blair himself was either lukewarm to or subsequently sceptical about. So one of the curious things is, if you read Blair's memoirs, he thinks the fox hunting ban was a mistake. He thinks that freedom of information was a mistake. He doesn't go a bundle on human rights. He's not sure
He's
that devolution...
He's still desperate for digital ID to become a thing,
true. He's not sure
He sees that as his unfinished business.
I think the thing is that the idea of Blair as a sort of Charter 88 constitutional reformer, the idea that he's sort of, Roy Jenkins' adopted son, that's not true. He is genuinely, I think, a reformer when it comes to public services and stern in the right way when it comes to crime. Where I disagree with him is I think he doesn't have much time for the notion of civil liberties, and also he is a neophiliac. If it's new, it's shiny, and it's technological,
yes,
he loves it, and I'm in the opposite camp. Now, I think it's important. That's not to say that the 13 years should be viewed through a different prism overall, because terrible things happen. But I think those terrible things happen, and this takes me to the second point, because there was an inadequate understanding of the tenor of the times. So there was an inadequate understanding amongst some of the people around Blair, including Blair himself, of the fact that traditional clause for socialism having gone out of the way, the radical left or the energetic left or the thinking left moved their energies into constitutional reform and into what became wokery. And I think he was insufficiently aware of that. Similarly, for conservatives between 2010 and 2014, there was an intellectually inadequate appreciation of the way in which the culture was moving left. So there were very few conservatives who were trying to push the boundaries in a left-wing direction, but there were all too many of us who were simply unaware, uncomprehending, or incapable of resisting the social trends.
Kwasi Kwarteng came on our podcast, the Edition podcast last week, and he was talking about how when he was working with George Osborne, that it was Osborne who, and perhaps you may agree or disagree with this, but it was Osborne who basically said, we're not really going to talk about stuff like family life, marriage. That's old hat.
Yes.
We've got more important things to do. Let's be socially liberals. Let's hug a husky or whatever. I think that was a problem because...
Well, there was definitely a division between George Osborne and David Cameron. David Cameron believed that it was right to recognise marriage in the tax system. David Cameron believed that Toryism involved the state intervening, modestly but clearly, in order to support certain institutions. George is a purer classical liberal, what the Germans might call an ordo liberal. He does not believe in using the state to sponsor any particular form of lifestyle choice. It's also the case that George has a dislike of public moralising. The two come together. Now, I think that George's position is not left-wing, but it's not conservative.
No, it's a fundamentally liberal position. I mean, I do take your point about things sort of happening by accident, and perhaps Tony Blair didn't mean to have his hand on the scales as much as he did, but I kind of refer to, you know, what it says in the book of Matthew, by their fruits shall you know them.
Well, quite.
That all these things happened under Tony Blair, which have changed the country drastically, constitutionally, levels of immigration that no one ever wanted. Before Blair, we had something like 50,000 net migration a year on average over a number of years. Changing the country in dramatic ways that I feel were never really put to any kind of democratic... And of course, and the other, by their fruits shall you know them, what if any of it did the Conservative Party undo?
Well, I think both of those points are very fair. And it's undoubtedly the case that there were some people in the Labour governments between 1997 and 2010 who regarded migration as a means of changing the electorate in a way that would vote left. There are people like the former Blair speechwriter Andrew Neither who've made that clear. Similarly, there were a number of things that happened under Labour that the Conservatives not only didn't reverse, but sought to embrace and co-opt. My argument, and it may be too esoteric and too much of an excuse, but I think it's actually at the heart of things, is it is a mistake to think that all the bad things that happen in government are because of the willed acts of the leaders. A lot of it is because the leaders, those around them, and the parties misunderstand what is happening in wider society. We should, therefore, ask of our leaders that they have an account of what is happening in society and a plan or proposals for dealing with it. And that takes me back to Kemi Badenoch, because I think that she has analysed why wokery took hold and why that has an impact on our economy. It's not just a bad thing in itself. It also, through DEI, HR, net zero and other policies, corrodes growth. And she's talked about the way in which liberalism has been hacked. So, my view, of course I'm biased, would be to Anonymous that you are more likely to have not just active resistance, but the rollback of these things from someone who has, when there has been no advantage in it, a honest reckoning with their party's past, rather than any alternative.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're perhaps being a bit too kind to Tony Blair here. I do think much of what he did was by design. He gave a speech at I think it's the 1999 Labour conference, in which he explicitly identifies the, quote, forces of conservatism at being at the root of, every aspect of national decline. And another thing I dislike about Tony Blair is his terrible problem of being America-brained.
Yes.
I think that partly explains things like the introduction of a Supreme Court. And it was during that time that everyone began having a chief of staff rather than a principal secretary. He somehow blames the forces of conservatism to a British audience for the murder of Martin Luther King in 1968. This is pretty insane stuff. It's dishonest. He was an excellent communicator, and I think he got away with a certain amount because he was slick and he had exceptionally talented people working for him, even if I may disagree with absolutely everything that they did. But I don't think we should be hoodwinked by Blair and what he did.
No, I only want to try to make sure that, the good that men do is often turred with their bones. So I'm trying, not saying that Tony Blair was good, but just trying to draw that distinction.
There were some good things.
And some of the bad things were not his. But I think that the Blair settlement, because as you say, inescapably, I can identify other factors at work. But when you take on that job, the buck stops with you. The Blair settlement, as understood, lies at the heart of many of the problems that need to be addressed.
This question is from Fraser Rogers. Nigel Farage was irritated to be asked who would be the Reform Chancellor. Michael, what's the most irritated you've been with a journalist's question? And Maddie, which sketch of yours do you hope has most irritated its subject?
I can't remember a single example of an irritating question. There must have been many. I remember an irritating programme. Funnily enough, while I'm a big fan of the BBC, I'm a particular disliker of BBC breakfast TV because the questions there fall between two stools. They have neither the rigour of a Justin Webb or a Mashal Hussain on the Today programme, nor do they have the cheery approachability of Good Morning Britain. They occupy a halfway sofa between the two. And I always found that the presenters there would display a sense of outrage at whatever the government had done, but impatience with any explanation. And there was a gap between the fact that they were trying to act as the F.E. Smith or the Marshall Hall, interrogating the guilty minister, and then that they would flip onto the next charge rather than having a proper conversation. So, there is something about that, to me, unstable mixture between high-minded Ruthenianism and comfy
Hectoring.
Breakfast conversation.
Yes.
Which doesn't work, and I found that irritating. But some people would probably say that's because they had my number and I was just worried about being found out.
I know what you mean, but I found that there was I'm sorry to bring everything back to lockdown. I think it got a lot worse during lockdown, that there became this moralistic, hectoring moralism became the order of the day in TV interviews.
Yes.
And it is different to interviews of the past. You only have to look at them. I know that there were obviously some interviewers that could be rude and unpleasant on occasion, but often they would get to that gently and then they would kind of bring up the sucker punch towards the end.
Yes.
But increasingly it's this mawkish sentimentality which I dislike. It's you've got a minister in front of you and then you say, I've got Audrey on the phone here and she's very upset about her winter fuel payments. What do you have to say to Audrey? And I'm like, I just don't think that's a very... Maybe I'm being too cynical.
No, I think you're right.
I just think you shouldn't beat people over the head with emotional mawkishness. Like, you're not going to get to the bottom of anything that way.
No, I don't mind people being rude. I do object to people being stupid, and I particularly object, as you quite rightly point out, to questions which are being asked with the sole aim of getting someone to squirm emotionally rather than respond intellectually. How can you live with yourself is the cry of an injured and wounded heart, not a means of elucidating quite what has gone wrong with any government.
I once went on Breakfast TV to talk about, I think I was arguing, it's on Good Morning Britain, I think, and I was arguing that I think I was saying that the free TV licenses for the over 75 should be means tested, which I thought was a fairly uncontroversial thing to say. Like, I don't see why I should pay for David Attenborough to have a free TV license. But this was like massively controversial. And they had also like completely stuffed the panel. So it was really unfair. So I was there. There was a disability activist. There was a nice old lady. And I think they might even have had Esther Ranson, now I think of it. But then before we get into my interview, they have another lady on the phone who's really upset. And we listened to her talking about how her TV license connects her with the world and how she doesn't know what she'll do without it. And then Piers Morgan, who's the presenter, just goes to me and he's like, what do you have to say to her? What do you have to say to Doreen about her TV license? And I was just like, well,
Her son should pay for it.
You come up you start giving stats about how after housing costs are accounted for, pensioner households are better off on average than working households, for example. There's none of that because we've got Doreen on the other line. You can't say that.
Yeah.
So I really dislike the sentimental mode, and I hate it when it comes up in Parliament too, where it often does, because often people directly invoke spectators in the gallery and say, so-and-so's mum is here, we've campaigned for this. You can hardly say that's not a good idea because so-and-so's mum is right there. Yeah. And you can't really say, sorry, I think there are problems with this idea.
I completely agree with you. The other terrible habit I have now is when I listen to some of those interviews, I answer for the minister or the politician as I would have wished to. So there's a long and lengthy question, and I want to respond or hear the minister respond. What? That's idiotic. Have you finished? And I know that may be satisfying for your ego, Nick, but actually it's totally irrelevant to... I don't know why I'm saying Nick there. It's probably unfair to Nick Robinson.
Could be any Nick.
Could be any old Nick.
Yeah, there's loads of people called Nick in the world. I actually think the public might prefer that in some ways, because we're so fed up with the insincere, formulaic responses that almost all politicians give of whatever party. Let me be very clear, blah, blah, blah. Or they always begin with, well, look, which is a Blairism. Sorry to bring it back to him again. But
and also the internalisation of a question. So, Maddie, if you're asking me whether or not this policy will benefit you directly, then the answer, of course, is yes. So these are all techniques that are irritating for the listener. And I suspect that's the case, that a degree of sort of Alan Clark rudeness at certain times would be welcome, though probably career limiting.
We journalists have to remember that we're perhaps the only profession in the country that's more despised than politicians. So many people will say, even if there has been some rudeness to a journalist, they'll say, oh, well, fair enough, give him one from me, so to speak. And
in terms of irritation sketch writing?
I don't write the sketch with the irritation of the subject in mind. Primarily, I do it to express what I feel, but hopefully to entertain and make people laugh. That's my kind of number one goal. If someone told me that they laughed, that's like the number one thing that I look for. On the whole, actually, politicians are generally quite happy to be sketched, I find, because it shows that they are at least relevant. There are a couple of Labour MPs who I've just kind of randomly said something about them. Often I have a particular aversion to that kind of toad question, which is often asked. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we are levelling up and blah, 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 and everything's going fantastically well? I really don't like it when they do that, because it's a waste of a question. So I have randomly sort of called out people who've done this in my sketch. And I sometimes see them looking up at me with a slight fear because I've gone for them once before. And I don't know, I sometimes I feel a bit bad, but I also think that maybe if they're made fun of, they'll stop asking toad questions and they'll grow a backbone. Maybe they need to be mocked a bit more before they can, see the error of their ways. On the whole, people are good sports. I've only had a few occasions where someone contacted me directly or had someone contact me directly to say, we're very upset that you wrote this.
Yeah, you have quite rightly identified John Slinger, the Member of Parliament for Rugby, as one of the most energetically sycophantic Labour backbenchers. But if I were John Slinger, rather than being irritated by this, I would print them all out, hand them over to the whips and say,
give me a job.
Exactly.
It's a job.
I'm the Saint Sebastian of the backbenchers. I have been martyred many times by Maddie Grant. The least you can do is make me a minister, because that will incentivise more arslican from other backbenchers. And at the moment, it is a lonely furrow that I plough. So in that sense, your scorn is actually probably for him a path to, if not greatness, certainly a red box. So you're right. It is far better.
What more does the man have to do?
Quite. It's far better to be sketched and skewered than not to be. And also, the point you make about David Lammy's continuance in office is that at a dreary time for the country, we need David there. It would be a much less cheering prospect for all of us.
He makes my heart sing. Honestly, when he's so funny. Only David Lammy could do what he does. Only David Lammy could complain about the absence of police in a neighbourhood while standing directly in front of a police officer that he can't see. It's like comic perfection. And there's only one man in Parliament that could have done it.
And do you think that there are other members of Parliament who, well, have there been people who, even when you've absolutely skewered them, have indicated to you that they really enjoyed it and they've appreciated the fact that they were fair game?
I tell you what, I did write a piece about, it was Wes Streeting, it was one of the Labour conferences. They've for some time now, they've started putting Wes Streeting onto the final day of the conference. So the leader's speech happens on Tuesday, and then Wes gets the kind of the graveyard shift on Wednesday. A lot of the delegates have already gone. I wonder if this is slightly done deliberately so that Wes, who is a much more charismatic and impressive speaker, doesn't detract too much from Dear Leader, is one possible interpretation. But I did something about, I can't remember what he said. It wasn't his best work. And I in my sketch, I wrote something like, the two assisted dying tents in the conference hall were beginning to look appealing or something. I was on TV with Wes Streeting not long after that, and he said that he'd really enjoyed my skewering of him, which made me like him more and think this is someone that has a sense of humour and perhaps a bit of a sense of perspective, even if politics is, there are many egos and a great deal of narcissism. It's quite nice to think that maybe some of them could see the point perhaps in why the satire is there to occasionally deflate the ego and bring them back to earth.
There is one response to a question which also invokes an irritating sketch that I will mention, though listeners might worry because it involves two of my favourite politicians. When Kemi Badenoch was asked about Shabana Mahmood at a press conference a couple of weeks ago, she defended Shabana Mahmood and she called out the Guardian sketch writer John Crace because she believed that John Crace had said in his sketch essentially that Shabana Mahmood had no right because of her background to take the position that she was taking on asylum. And Kemi was magnificently dismissive of John Crace. Now, my natural instinct is don't complain. The free press is right.
No.
You've got absolutely...
Sketch writers live to be told off.
Exactly. You've got, absolutely free reign to comment on anything as a politician. Don't turn on the inky-fingered hacks.
Yes.
But I make one exception for that moment because even though it had shown that John Crace had got underneath her skin, there still was something magnificent about the sassiness with which she expressed herself. So my general rule would be, if you're a politician, take it with dignity and wait until you're like me, a has-been, before then hitting back.
If you'd like to submit your questions for Quite Right next week, you can do so at spectator.co.uk/Quite Right.